Hey everyone, my name is Lance, and this is Amped About Aimpad. For today's episode, I'd like to focus on a question that I'm asked many times, and that is, what's the point of having analog keys on a keyboard if there aren't any games that actually support analog keys on a keyboard? So I'm here to finally put that question to rest and demonstrate that not only do many games support analog keys on a keyboard, but actually most games support analog keys on a keyboard. So I've done a really good job at documenting on our website at aimpad.com/compatibility the number of games that support analog movement, and there is hundreds of them. I've spent literally hundreds of hours collecting data, testing games for the good of all mankind to find out what games support analog movement and which games don't. And I've done a pretty extensive job here, and I've had some other people that have supported me and giving some input from their examples as well. But I wanted to officially and formally document the method that I use to define what is a full support game and what's maybe a partial support or no support and things like that. So to do that, these are 6 categories of how I've defined analog support in games. So the first of those is no gamepad support. And essentially that means the developer has not developed the game to have any type of gamepad support at all. That might be games like Civilization 5 or adventure games, or for example, like in this game, Slay the Spire. There is no gamepad support defined in the game. So if you use the analog stick, it makes no meaningful difference in the game one way or the other, just because that type of input's not even considered to be relevant. You would likely be playing Slay the Spire with a mouse. Now you could program the analog stick to act like a mouse, as in this example here, but it's still not quite the same. If you have a mouse, you might as well just use the mouse anyways. But more or less, that's the first category of no gamepad support. The second category is no analog movement. Now, this means that the game developer has developed the game to use a Xbox controller or some type of joystick, but there is no analog meaningful movement. So for example, in this game Stardew Valley, I can move the stick a gradual amount, but it's either not moving or moving. There's no in between. So it's basically no difference between using a keyboard and using a gamepad. The experience is exactly the same. So that's that category. The next category is no analog movement and mouse aim at the same time. So this one's kind of a little confusing, but the game developers have developed for the mindset of using an Xbox controller as well as using a keyboard and mouse, but they have not taken into account the possibility of using both at the same time. So for example, in this game Metal Gear Solid 5, what you can see is can have great, excellent analog movement, and there's lots of stealth elements to this game, which is fantastic to have that. But as soon as I start to move the mouse, that mouse movement for the camera, it removes the ability to control the camera. But if I do it just by itself for the mouse, I can no longer use analog movement at the same time. So it's kind of flopping back and forth between those two, and using both at the same time is not possible. The next category is partial support. So now, partial support is a relatively rare category, but these are games where a portion of the game might have analog movement, but a portion of the game has none whatsoever. So for example, in this game English Country Tune, it has fantastic analog movement and control over this view of the menu, basically of how you're going to select a level to play. But once you actually get into the level to play, it's basically there's no difference between using a keyboard or using a gamepad. It's moving from one block to another, and there is no analog movement that matters in that game. So there's portions of the game that work and portions that don't. The next is full support. So full support game basically has to have some type of analog meaningful movement, meaning if you push the key in a little bit, you might move a small speed, and if you push it down all the way, you might have a faster speed. So there's going to be 3 distinct states of no movement, a small movement, and some increase in movement. But it doesn't have fantastic support. It's a good example. So here is a Dark Souls 3. You can see if I push the joystick in a little bit, there is an animation that shows for that slow speed, and if I push it down all the way, there's a second distinct animation speed, and you actually have some good directional control of your movement as well. So this is a full supported game. It works really well, and you can have the mouse movement at the same time. The last category is awesome support. So these games are games where there's more than just the slow speed and an increase of fast speed. There's a gradual I guess, level of control. There has to be at least 3 different speeds beyond not moving at all to have awesome support, in my opinion. And you also have to have the ability to control a 360-degree movement, combining both of those 2 directions at the same time. So a good example of this is Dishonored 2. So you can see I have full analog movement speed control. There's multiple levels of speed that I have, and I control the direction and 360 degrees of movement to have a awesome experience using, in this particular example, a stealth kill. So hopefully that helps explain how I've categorized things. Now, the way that I have tested this, I've tested multiple games. I've tested well over 1,000 games, and this is the breakdown of those different categories. So you can see the biggest category is this awesome category. So actually most of the games that I've tested, including many different games that have, I mean, we're talking lots of games that are adventure games that are just point-and-click adventures that you have no analog movement control whatsoever, or strategy games, or 4X games and things like that just have analog movement. Doesn't really have a place in those types of games. But I'm just doing everything. These are all the games across different Steam library that I have, or Epic Games, or whatever. So this is a broad range of categories, but 29% of them have awesome analog movement. That's pretty impressive. The next biggest category is 21% for full support. So actually, combining these two, half of all games have some type of analog meaningful movement. Partial is pretty small, just a 2% of it. And then you have no gamepad support is about 20% of the games that I've tested. No analog movement is 17%, and then the smallest category beyond partial is doesn't support gamepad and mouse at the same time. I've had lots of people tell me like there's so many games out there that that you can't use the analog stick and a mouse at the same time. That's not true. Not true at all. So I can 100% declare that is not true. But so if you were to look at it from this perspective, slicing up the pie, at least half of the games support analog movement to some degree. But if the game developer never developed for gamepad support at all, or they never put analog movement in the game at all, there's not much I can do about it. So it's not really fair for me to compare it to that perspective. But if I were to look at it from the perspective of, does the game have good analog movement, and does it allow some type of control for the mouse, it breaks out like this. So 83% of games that should have analog movement, or that have been programmed with analog movement and should allow you to use the mouse at the same time, is 83%. Now this also takes into account games that may not use the mouse for camera control at all. You might have like platformers that have analog movement and things like that. But if the game does have analog movement and prevents you from using the mouse, and there are a good number of them, there's about 17% of those games that should work that don't, but still from the broad perspective of things, the vast majority of games that should support aimpad actually do support aimpad. So it's a pretty impressive accomplishment, I think, that we've been able to do to utilize the existing infrastructure that game developers are already used to programming for, and actually have a meaningful difference for the way that you play games. All right, so there you go. If anybody says, what's the point of having analog keys on a keyboard? It's because most games actually support using analog keys on a keyboard, and it's awesome. And you should have a keyboard that has analog keys on it. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more, go ahead and subscribe. Otherwise, thank you for watching.